Have you ever looked at a group of people and thought, who exactly are they? That question has followed Louisiana Creoles for centuries, and the answer is far stranger, far deeper, and far more powerful than anyone expected. Something extraordinary happened in the swamps and bayous of Louisiana. A group of people emerged that didn't fit neatly into any category. They weren't fully European. They weren't fully African. They weren't fully Native American. They were something entirely new, and for generations, nobody could quite explain how or why. And, for generations, nobody could quite explain how or why. Scientists, historians, and genealogists argued about it. Families kept secrets. Records were buried. The truth was hidden under layers of politics, race laws, and human survival. But now, DNA has stepped in. And what it revealed is one of the most remarkable stories in American history. Before we go any further, if this kind of deep, honest storytelling speaks to you, hit that like button right now. It genuinely helps this channel reach more people who deserve to hear stories like this. Subscribe so you never miss one, and share this video with someone who loves real history. All right, let's get into it. To understand Louisiana Creoles, you first have to understand where they came from. And that means going back to a time when Louisiana wasn't even part of the United States. It was a colonial territory. France claimed it in the late 1600s. Spain controlled it for a few decades too. And from the very beginning, this place was different from anywhere else in North America. Most of colonial America was built on strict separation. European settlers on one side, enslaved Africans on another. This place was different from anywhere else in North America. Most of colonial America was built on strict separation. European settlers on one side, enslaved Africans on another, native people pushed to the edges. But Louisiana didn't work that way. Not because the people there were more enlightened, but because the situation on the ground made rigid separation almost impossible. The colony was isolated. It was surrounded by dense forests and dangerous swamps. The French settlers were outnumbered. They needed alliances, they needed help. And they got it from Native American tribes and from the Africans, who were brought there by force. New Orleans was founded in 1718. Within just a few decades, it became one of the most ethnically complex cities, who were brought there by force. New Orleans was founded in 1718. Within just a few decades, it became one of the most ethnically complex cities in the entire Western Hemisphere. French colonists, Spanish administrators, free Africans, enslaved Africans from dozens of different ethnic groups across West and Central Africa, Native Americans from local tribes, refugees from Haiti after the Revolution, German immigrants, Irish immigrants, and more, all crowded into one humid, fever-ridden, beautiful, chaotic city. And in that chaos, something happened. People mixed, not just culturally, but biologically. Relationships formed between people who would never have met anywhere else. Some were voluntary, some were not. Some were loving. Some were exploitative. But all of them left a genetic mark on the generations that followed. The term Creole itself is part of the confusion. It comes from the Portuguese word crioulo, which originally meant a person of European descent born in the colonies rather than in Europe. But in Louisiana, the word evolved. It started being used for people of mixed ancestry, then for free people of color specifically. Then it became a cultural identity tied to language, religion, food, and music. Today, different people define it in different ways. And that's part of what makes Louisiana Creoles tied to language, religion, food, and music. Today, different people define it in different ways. And that's part of what makes Louisiana Creoles so hard to categorize and so fascinating. For a long time, the genetic origins of Louisiana Creoles were debated mostly through documents, church records, slave manifests, land deeds, census data. These records told pieces of the story, but they were full of gaps. Some were deliberately falsified. Under Louisiana's complex racial classification laws, a person's documented race could determine whether they were free or enslaved, whether they could own property, whether they could marry certain people, whether their children would be considered free. So families made choices. Whether their children would be considered free. So families made choices. They recorded what protected them. The truth got complicated. And the Native American presence in the genetic story of Louisiana Creoles was perhaps the most underdocumented of all. Tribes like the Choctaw, Natchez, Huma, and many others interacted constantly with both African and European populations. Some of these interactions led to children who were absorbed into the Creole community. But proving it on paper was almost impossible because Native Americans were rarely documented the same way Europeans and Africans were in colonial records. This is exactly where DNA changed everything. Were rarely documented the same way Europeans and Africans were in colonial records. This is exactly where DNA changed everything. When large-scale genetic studies began examining Louisiana Creoles in the early 2000s and gained more traction by the 2010s, researchers were genuinely surprised by what they found. not because mixing had occurred, that much was expected, but because of the proportions and the patterns and the specific origins of the DNA itself. The African ancestry found in Louisiana Creoles traces back to remarkably specific regions. The biggest contributors were from Senegambia, which includes modern-day Senegal and Gambia. The Wolof, the Mandinka, the Fulani, these groups were heavily represented. Then there were significant contributions from the Kingdom of Dahomey, modern-day Benin and Togo, the Fon and the Yu people, and then from West Central Africa, particularly from the Congo Basin, the Bakongo, the Mbundu peoples. What makes this especially significant is that these weren't random African populations. These were groups with very specific cultures, languages, and traditions. And when you look at Louisiana Creole culture, the music, the spiritual practices, the folk medicine, the food, the language patterns, you can trace direct lines back to these specific African ethnic groups. The DNA doesn't just confirm ancestry, it confirms cultural survival. These people didn't just mix biologically, they carried entire civilizations inside them and rebuilt pieces of those civilizations on the banks of the Mississippi. The European ancestry in Louisiana Creoles is also remarkably specific. The French ancestry is dominant in many families, particularly from regions like Normandy and Brittany. There's also significant Spanish ancestry, especially in families whose records trace back to the Spanish colonial period. Like Normandy and Brittany, there's also significant Spanish ancestry, especially in families whose records trace back to the Spanish colonial period, between 1769 and 1803. And then there's a notable thread of German ancestry, which surprises many people, but makes sense when you know that a large German immigrant settlement existed just upriver from New Orleans in the 1700s, in an area still called the German Coast today. Then there's the Native American ancestry. This is where the genetic story becomes almost poetic, because for generations, many Louisiana Creole families knew they had Native American blood. Grandmothers talked about it, old photographs showed it, but the official records rarely confirmed it. DNA has now begun to confirm it. The Native American markers found in Louisiana, Creole DNA, most frequently trace back to groups indigenous to the Gulf South, particularly populations related to the Choctaw, and broader haplogroups associated with the ancient indigenous peoples of North America's southeastern region. In some families, the percentage is small. In others, it's surprisingly high. But the important thing is that it's there. It's real. And it's been there all along, quietly waiting for science to catch up with family memory. Here's something that makes this even more layered. Louisiana had a legal category that existed almost nowhere else in North America. They called it the gens de couleur libres, the free people of color. This was an entire social class, not enslaved, not white, something in between. In their peak, before the Civil War, free people of color in New Orleans owned businesses, property, and in some documented and painful cases, even other enslaved people themselves. They sent their children to France to be educated. They formed orchestras and theaters. They built a culture so rich and so refined that it stunned European visitors who came expecting to find a rough colonial outpost. This community, educated, proud, multilingual, navigating a world that constantly tried to categorize and diminish them, is the heart of what we now call Louisiana Creole identity. And the DNA evidence shows that this community drew from every stream of humanity flowing through Louisiana. Every root, every source, every origin. Now, pause here for just a second. If you're finding this as fascinating as I am, I want you to do something. Write the word Creole in the comments right now. Just that one word. I want to see who's with me on this journey. It lets me know this kind of storytelling matters to you, and it helps this video reach people who need to hear this history. Now let's keep going because the story gets even deeper. What DNA also revealed was something geneticists call admixture patterns. Basically, the specific way different ancestries are blended together within a population. And in Louisiana Creoles, these patterns are unlike any other population in North America. They're not just mixed. The mixing happened in waves, at specific historical moments. And the genetic fingerprint of each wave is still visible today. The first major wave came with the earliest French colonization and the simultaneous forced importation of enslaved Africans. This created the initial Afro-European blending. The second wave came from Haiti. After the Haitian Revolution of 1791, tens of thousands of refugees fled to New Orleans. Many of them were already of mixed ancestry themselves. Afro-Haitian, French-Haitian. This created the initial Afro-European blending. The second wave came from Haiti. After the Haitian Revolution of 1791, tens of thousands of refugees fled to New Orleans. Many of them were already of mixed ancestry themselves. Afro-Haitian, French-Haitian. and some with Spanish Caribbean mixture. This more than doubled the population of New Orleans almost overnight and brought an entirely new genetic and cultural layer to the city. The third wave came through a complicated process of what historians call plissage. This was a system, informal but deeply embedded in New Orleans society, where free women of color entered into long-term relationships with white Creole men. These relationships were often arranged through actual ceremonies, not legal marriages under the law, but socially recognized unions. These relationships were often arranged through actual ceremonies, not legal marriages under the law, but socially recognized unions. The women received property, protection, and social standing. The men gained companionship and connection to Creole social circles. The children of these unions were often educated, free, and added yet another layer to the genetic and cultural mosaic. Each of these waves left its mark in the DNA. And when modern researchers began mapping these layers, they found that Louisiana Creoles are essentially a living record of 3 centuries of history. The genome tells the story the documents tried to hide. There's also something researchers noticed the documents tried to hide. There's also something researchers noticed about the mitochondrial DNA. The DNA passed only through the maternal line. This type of DNA is useful for tracing deep ancestry through the mother's mother's mother, going back as far as you can go. In Louisiana Creoles, the mitochondrial haplogroups are extraordinarily diverse. African haplogroups like L1, L2, L3. Native American haplogroups like A and B. European haplogroups like H, J, and T. All present, all real. This is significant because it means the female ancestors of Louisiana Creoles came from genuinely different worlds. An African woman kidnapped from Senegambia, a Native American woman from a Gulf Coast tribe, a French woman who crossed the Atlantic hoping for a new life, a Haitian woman fleeing revolution. Their DNA, specifically the DNA passed through women, is still alive today in Louisiana Creole families. That is not a metaphor. That is a biological fact. The Y chromosome data, which traces the paternal line, tells a somewhat different story and an important one. The Y chromosome haplogroups in Louisiana Creoles are predominantly European. This reflects the historical reality that most of the cross-racial relationships in colonial Louisiana involved European men and non-European women. Not always by choice, not always by force, but heavily skewed in that direction. The power dynamics of colonialism are literally written into the DNA. The genome doesn't just tell you where people came from, it tells you how power worked. And this is crucial. Despite what the Y chromosome data shows about paternal lines, Louisiana Creole culture, identity, language, food, spirituality, and music are overwhelmingly African in their roots. The culture survived through the women, through the maternal lines, through the grandmothers and the great-grandmothers who remembered where they came from and made sure their children remembered too. DNA and culture don't always move together. But in this case, the mitochondrial DNA and the cultural inheritance align almost perfectly. Now, let's talk about something that often gets left out of these conversations. The Louisiana Creole language, because language is genetic too, in its own way. It carries ancestry, it carries history, and it tells us things that DNA sometimes can't. Louisiana Creole, also called Kouri-Vini, is a French-based Creole language. It developed as a way for people of different linguistic backgrounds to communicate. African slaves speaking Wolof, Fon, Yoruba, and dozens of other languages. French settlers, Native Americans, Spanish administrators of other languages. French settlers, Native Americans, Spanish administrators. They needed a common tongue. And what emerged was Kouri-Vini, a language with French grammar at its core, but with African words, African rhythms, and African logic woven through every sentence. Linguists who study this language say it is one of the clearest proofs of African cultural dominance in Louisiana Creole identity. Even as the European legal and political systems tried to define and control these people, the language they created to talk to each other was fundamentally African in its structure and its soul. You can hear it. Even if you don't speak it, you can hear it. The same is true of Zydeco music. Zydeco is Louisiana Creole music. It has European instruments, the accordion brought by German immigrants. It has African rhythms, the call and response, the syncopation, the improvisation. It has Native American influence in its modal qualities, and it has something else that doesn't fit neatly into any category. A raw, aching, joyful energy that can only come from people who have survived impossible things and found a way to turn that survival into something beautiful. That energy is not metaphorical. A way to turn that survival into something beautiful. That energy is not metaphorical. It's cultural. It's genetic. It's the living expression of every ancestor who went into making a Louisiana Creole person. But here's the tension that never fully goes away. Louisiana Creoles have always existed in an uncomfortable space between categories. During slavery, the free Creoles of color occupied a middle position that gave them privileges other people of color didn't have. and created deep tensions with both the white community and the enslaved black community. After the Civil War, when Louisiana's racial laws changed, many Creoles found themselves reclassified as black under the one-drop rule, regardless of how they had lived or how they identified. Some Creoles passed as white and disappeared into white society. Some embraced black identity and became part of the civil rights movement. Some held on to Creole identity as a separate and distinct thing. And some families split, literally, with some members going one way and others going another. The same family divided by a racial classification system that forced people to choose. DNA doesn't care about those classifications. DNA just records what happened. And what it records is a story of connection, deep, complicated, multi-directional human connection across every boundary that societies tried to build. Modern Louisiana Creoles who have done DNA testing often describe the experience as both affirming and emotional. One man described opening his results and seeing African ancestry from 5 distinct regional groups, French ancestry confirmed, a small but real percentage of Native American ancestry, and feeling like he finally had proof of what his grandmother always told him. The results didn't tell him. He had proof of what his grandmother always told him. The results didn't tell him who he was. They confirmed who he already knew he was. That's something worth sitting with. For people whose history was deliberately obscured, through slavery, through racial reclassification laws, through the burning of records and the silencing of family stories, DNA is not just science, it's justice. It's the recovery of something that was taken. Before we get to the final chapter of this story, I want to ask you something directly. If this video has given you something, a new idea, a deeper understanding, a moment of real feeling, then please share it. Copy the link and send it to someone you know who would appreciate it. Post it somewhere. Tag someone. Because stories like this deserve to travel further than the algorithm alone will carry them. This is the kind of history that changes how people see themselves and each other. Help it reach more people. Now here's how the story ends, and why it matters more than ever. The mystery of Louisiana Creole genetic origins isn't really solved by DNA. What DNA does is confirm the mystery and give it scientific detail. It shows us that, yes, all of these things really happened. All of these connections were real. The French soldier and the Senegambian woman, the Haitian refugee and the native daughter, the German immigrant and the free woman of color, all of it happened. All of it left a mark. All of it is still alive. But what DNA can't tell you is what it felt like, what it took, what it cost. To be a person in colonial Louisiana trying to survive in a world designed to destroy you. To build a language so you could talk to people who spoke differently than you. To create music that held your grief and your joy at the same time. To pass down traditions through food and story and song because the written records were not safe and the laws were not on your side, and the only things you truly owned were your memories and your culture. Louisiana Creoles did all of that, and they did it across generations, across centuries, across every attempt by legal systems and social systems and physical violence to erase them or reduce them to a category that made someone else more comfortable. The DNA is extraordinary, but the people are more extraordinary than the DNA. What makes Louisiana Creoles unique is not just that they carry multiple ancestries. Many people in the world carry multiple ancestries. What makes them unique is that they built something coherent and beautiful and lasting out of those ancestries. They took the fragments of multiple broken worlds, African worlds disrupted by slavery, native worlds disrupted by colonization, European worlds transplanted into an alien landscape, and they built something new, something that had never existed before and would not exist anywhere else. You can taste it in the food. Gumbo is not an African dish. It's not a French dish. It's not a native dish. It's a Louisiana Creole dish, and it carries every one of those ancestries in a single bowl. The okra came from West Africa. The roux came from France. The fili powder, made from dried sassafras leaves, came from the Choctaw. The shrimp came from the Gulf. And what you get when you combine them is something that none of those traditions could have produced alone. That is the Louisiana Creole story. That is the genetic story. That is the human story. Combination producing something that transcends every ingredient. The question the DNA finally answered is not just about bloodlines, it's about what those bloodlines built when they met. And the answer is something magnificent, something resilient, something human in the deepest possible sense of that word. There are still questions that science can't fully answer. The exact proportions vary enormously from family to family. Some Louisiana Creoles test as predominantly African, some test as majority European, some have significant Native American ancestry, some have Caribbean admixture that reflects the Haitian refugee waves. There is no single Louisiana Creole genome. The population itself is a spectrum, and that spectrum is the point. Louisiana Creoles don't prove that race is biological. They prove almost the opposite. They prove that racial categories are human constructions, drawn and redrawn based on power, politics, and convenience. The DNA shows no clear lines. It shows gradients. It shows blending. It shows that the borders between races that societies tried to enforce were always imaginary. Biology never respected them. People did their best to cross them, sometimes out of love, sometimes out of survival, sometimes out of circumstance. And what was born from those crossings was something that no racial classification system can contain. That is why the question of Louisiana Creole identity has always made people uncomfortable. Not because it's confusing, but because it's clarifying. It shows everyone else the lie. It shows that the neat categories we use to divide humanity are just stories. Powerful stories, violent stories, stories with real consequences, but stories nonetheless. Biology tells a different story, and it's a more interesting one. The Louisiana Creoles are not an exception to American history. They are a concentrated expression of it. Every American carries more mixture than official racial categories suggest. The Creoles are just the place where that truth became undeniable, visible, and ultimately documented in the genome, and that is why their story matters. Not just for them, but for everyone, trying to understand what America really is, where it really came from, and what it might become. DNA revealed the truth. The truth is that these people are the product of the entire world meeting in one place. And what they made from that meeting, the language, the music, the food, the culture, the families, the identity, is one of the most remarkable things human beings have ever created. That's the story, that's the mystery, that's the answer. And honestly, the more you know about it, the more beautiful it becomes.